Today I'll be looking at and comparing the recently released Sony A6700 and the A7IV. It may seem strange to compare the full-frame $2,500 A7IV to the $1,400 Apsc sensor A6700. But I've talked to a number of people who are debating which of these two cameras to get, and I happen to own both of them, so I thought I would make a quick comparison video that will hopefully help people who are trying to decide which one to get. I primarily shoot video with these cameras, so I'll mostly be talking about the video features. I previously owned an A7C, and a little while back I upgraded to the A7IV. I found going from the 8-bit to 10-bit to be a really worthwhile upgrade. I received the A6700 a little while back, and I've been shooting with it quite a bit, and I've been really enjoying the experience. Both of these are really great cameras. They're both capable of 10-bit 422. The A6700 uses the same sensor as the FX30, which is a really good thing because that's a great camera. The A7IV has a 33 megapixel sensor, whereas the A6700 has a 26 megapixel sensor. Both have mechanical shutters, which is great if you're also going to be using these for photography. The A7IV downsamples its 4K from 7K, and the A6700 downsamples from 6K, and applies a small crop. For higher frame rates in 4K, they can both do 60 frames per second, but the A7IV has a 1.5 crop factor, which is something a lot of people were kind of disappointed about when the A7IV first came out. The A6700 can shoot in 120 with a 1.58 crop, but the A7IV has no 120 in 4K. You have to drop down to 1080 and it's 8-bit. Obviously, the biggest difference between these two cameras is the sensor size. The A7IV is a full frame, whereas the A6700 has an Apsc sensor. And this brings us to the age-long debate of Apsc versus full frame. And really, they're both great. The only practical difference for me is the crop factor for the Apsc and the better low light performance and better dynamic range you get from a full frame. Being smaller, the Apsc sensor has a 1.5 crop factor. This means with the same lens on a full frame and on an Apsc camera, the Apsc camera will have a longer focal length, so higher magnification and a narrower field of view, and also a higher f-stop, so less light will get in and you'll have a greater depth of field. So for example, I'll be comparing these two cameras using the Sony 35mm f1.8 on the A7IV and the Viltrox 23mm f1.4 on the A6700. With the Apsc 1.5 crop factor applied, the Viltrox is equivalent to a 34.5mm f2.1 on a full frame. So almost the identical focal length and a similar aperture, although with an aperture of 1.8, the full frame will have a shallower depth of field. And this is a big part of the appeal of full frame cameras. With a full frame, it's going to be easier to get that super blurry background you get from a shallow depth of field. The biggest advantages of Apsc lenses is their size. They tend to be a bit smaller than full-frame lenses, and their price. They're usually quite a bit cheaper than full-frame lenses. There are also some pretty fast Apsc lenses available now. Viltrox just released a 75mm 1.2 lens, and they have announced a new 27mm f1.2 lens. So while you're not going to get that extremely shallow depth of field you get from like an f1.2 lens on a full frame camera, with an f.2 on an Apsc sensor, you're still going to get a quite shallow depth of field. Also, there aren't a whole lot of f1.2 lenses available for full frame. The ones that are available tend to be pretty expensive. In fact, they probably cost more than the A6700. Both cameras have in-body stabilization, active mode stabilization, and record gyro data, so you can run them through Sony's Catalyst software. Autofocus has long been one of Sony's biggest strengths, and it's the main reason I switched from Panasonic cameras, which I really liked, but their autofocus just doesn't really compare to Sony's, although they are getting a lot better. And I don't really have any complaints about the A7IV's autofocus. It's really, really, really good. But the A6700 has inherited the AI processing unit from the A7R5, and it takes autofocus to the next level. It tracks a person perfectly, even if they're wearing a helmet or their back is to you. And in addition to humans, animals, and birds, it can also recognize trains, cars, insects, and even airplanes. It's pretty amazing how good autofocus has gotten, and this camera is about as good as it gets at this point. The A6700 has the new AI-based auto framing feature. Basically, it crops in and it will follow you around, and this could be a cool feature for someone who doesn't want to do this in post. With a fast lens, the A6700 is definitely no slouch in low light situations. However, a full frame sensor is generally going to be a lot better in low light, and the A7IV is particularly good in low light, and it has better low light sensitivity. Both of these cameras have viewfinders, which is great, and it's one of the main reasons I would pick these over the FX30 and the ZV-E1 unless you're just doing video. The viewfinder on the A7IV is definitely the better of the two. It's larger, it has a higher resolution and magnification, and it's centrally located, whereas the one on the A6700 is located on the side. I mostly shoot video, and I don't use the viewfinder a lot, but it's extremely handy if you're outside in really bright conditions. They both have the same LCD display. I would have really liked to see a higher resolution display on the newer A6700, but I guess, they're trying to keep costs down, and really it's fine. The A6700 also adds the new swiping features from some of the new Sony cameras. Basically, if you swipe from the side, you get some added menu buttons, and if you swipe up from the bottom, you get the function menu. And this can be really handy if you do a lot of shooting yourself with the screen turned towards you, like I'm doing right now. However, while you can customize the FN buttons, I haven't figured out a way to customize the side buttons. Maybe I'm just missing something, or if not, I hope they add this ability in a future firmware upgrade. The menu systems are pretty similar. The biggest difference I've noticed is with the log settings. I shoot in S-Log most of the time, and the older menu handled this with picture profiles, whereas on the new 6700, it has its own setting. And speaking of S-Log, the A6700 has a very handy feature where you can load your own LUTs directly into the camera. And it's a really great feature that I wish the A7IV had. It can be really helpful to kind of see what your graded footage is going to look like. One thing that the A7IV has is its Super 35 mode. And this is a really cool feature where with the touch of a button, you basically go into Apsc mode with a 1.5 crop. For pictures, this does reduce the megapixels, I think, to 14, but with video, it doesn't really seem to affect the quality. But essentially, it gives every lens you have two focal lengths. So a 35mm with the 1.5 crop factor becomes a 50mm. This mode also lets you use APS-C lenses on your full-frame camera. Obviously, the A6700 doesn't have this feature as it's always an APS-C camera. Sony cameras tend not to have great rolling shutter performance, and this is definitely something I missed from my Panasonic cameras, which were much better. The A6700 does seem to be a bit better than the A7IV though, although with the A7IV, if you go into Super 35 mode, the rolling shutter is a bit better. Physically, the first thing you'll notice about these two cameras is that the A7IV is larger and heavier. I have the Falcam Ulanzi cage on mine, so it looks even bigger. And by the way, I love these cages. The Ulanzi F38 and F22 quick release system is great. If you haven't tried it, try it. As soon as they release a cage for the A6700, I'm definitely going to buy it. Both cameras feel great to hold, but personally, I love the smaller size and weight of the A6700. The body is fairly similar to the older 6000 series, but they've added a front dial, which is really handy. The A7IV definitely wins on the amount of customizable buttons it has, and it has an extra dial. Also has that little nipple joystick thing, which photographers really like, and it can be handy for making adjustments in video as well. But I feel like the A6700 has just enough buttons, and the layout's pretty good. It really has good ergonomics and feels great in your hand. Both cameras have separate photo, video, and S&Q modes. And coming from the A7C, I absolutely love this. Each mode remembers your settings, so if you're switching between taking pictures and doing video, you don't have to go in and change all your settings like picture profiles. Both cameras also have 3 memory slots, but because you can't take a custom white balance shot in these modes, I tend not to use them too much. This is definitely something I wish Sony would address and change. The A7IV has a full-sized HDMI port, whereas the A6700 only has a micro HDMI port. And this is actually something I really don't like about the A6700. A full-size HDMI port is just so much more durable and rugged and reliable, and I worry about breaking the micro HDMI port in the A6700. Both cameras use the Sony Apsc batteries, which is great because they last for a long time. You can also power both of these cameras with USB-C, and then they'll pretty much record indefinitely. Both cameras can be used for streaming. The A7IV has 2 memory slots, whereas the A6700 only has 1. This isn't really a big deal for me as I'm not a professional, but if you are shooting professionally, then you're probably going to want a camera with 2 memory slots for redundancy. So, as I said in the beginning, these are both great cameras, and you really can't go wrong with either of them. I think which one you should get depends on how you're going to use it. I think if you're a professional videographer or photographer, or you need to shoot in really low light environments, then the A7IV is going to be the better camera. With its full frame sensor, full-size HDMI port, 2 card slots, and more controls, it's just going to suit a professional environment better. However, if you're not a professional or you're using this mostly to make YouTube videos, I think the A6700 is probably going to be the better choice. It's significantly cheaper, and it's a pretty incredible little camera. Basically, they took an FX30 sensor and added all the latest and greatest features from the ZVE1 and the A7R5. In fact, I've decided to sell my A7IV and keep my A6700. For me, it just checks all the right boxes without too many compromises. It's 10-bit. I don't really perceive a quality difference in the video. It covers all the frame rates I would need. APS-C lenses are cheaper. I don't really shoot in very low light situations, and I love the smaller form factor. So let me know what you think. If you're choosing between these 2 cameras, let me know which one you're leaning towards and why in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching.